So good to have you here with us. Just telling the audience about your new book, James Madison and the Making of America. And why don't you tell us kind of what the idea behind this book is, and what James Madison and his story can teach us about what America should be doing today?
Well, boy, that's a big question. Actually, what happened was that when I began at graduate school at the University of Virginia in 1992, I had in mind writing a dissertation about John C. Calhoun. And my advisor, when I asked him what I could do for a master's thesis that would set a kind of background for Calhoun, he said, well, why don't you look at James Madison and 1798? He said, nobody's done that in forever. And I found after doing that that periodically when I was working on other projects about the Constitution or about the Revolution in Virginia, I kept coming back to questions about Madison. And not only did I keep coming back to Madison, but it seemed that I always disagreed with the received wisdom. So after publishing many peer-reviewed articles in scholarly journals about Madison, and after writing several other books that had to do with him somehow or another, I finally decided I should collect all of these important changes in what people think about him between two covers, and that's where this project came from.
And so why should our viewers, the people who are interested in the Constitution and liberty and Ron Paul, why should they read this book?
Well, the bottom line is that Madison is the fellow who developed the argument in debate in Congress in 1791 that just as he had told people in the Virginia Ratification Convention in 1788, the Constitution only gave the Congress a few powers that were enumerated in the Constitution. What we think of as the Jeffersonian interpretation of the Constitution really was first developed by Madison. Madison, and these are ways in which my book corrects the received wisdom. Madison and his fellow Federalists, that is, people who favored ratifying the Constitution, sold the Constitution in the Virginia Ratification Convention as creating a government with limited powers. Now, this has always been said to be a kind of anti-federalist, anti-constitutional position, but that's actually the way the Federalists sold it, the people who persuaded the American people that they ought to agree to live under it. And besides that, and this is another way in which my book is a novel, I show that in the Virginia Ratification Convention, where the Virginians agreed to live under this new Constitution, the Federalists said that not only was this Constitution going to grant Congress only limited powers, but in case the federal government abused these powers, Virginia could reclaim them, which is another way of saying, of course, that they could secede, they could pull out of the Union. And again, we've been told that this was the anti-federalist, anti-constitutional position, but I show in the book that it was actually laid out by the Federalists, by Madison's chief allies in the Virginia Ratification Convention. This is one of several places in the book at which I show that Madison's career has been severely miscast by past historians, and I do it all from primary materials. It's not some crackpot theory. In fact, several very prominent historians have already lauded the book. So, for example, recently in the American Conservative magazine, Ralph Ketchum, who is one of the outstanding Madison scholars of the last 50 years, called my chapter on the Philadelphia Convention that wrote the Constitution brilliant. That was his word. Besides that, Daniel Walker Howe said that the key part of the book is the part where I describe the Richmond Convention and the drafting of the Bill of Rights. That's another area, of course, in which Madison took the lead. And again, what we see is that the reason why people who support Ron Paul ought to be interested is the book shows that Ron Paul's constitutional position is more or less interchangeable with Madison's position. So it's the other candidates who stand for a version of the Constitution different from the one that the American people were sold.
We hear a lot in the liberty movement, the Ron Paul movement lately, about the concept of nullification. And we know that Thomas Jefferson, of course, was a great supporter of the concept of nullification. And people argue both ways with Madison. You hear, well, he wrote, he was involved in the Virginia resolutions, but later he said things that suggest that no, nullification is not okay. Does your book shed light on that controversy?
Well, actually, I was the first scholar that I'm aware of, and I'm fully familiar with the literature over the last 80 years about these questions. I was the first scholar to show that there was an inconsistency between what Madison said in 1798 and what he said in 1832 during the nullification crisis. What I show in the book is that, yes, Madison and Jefferson were the ones who invented this idea of nullification in 1798, but contrary to what we've always been told, this was not the view of the Constitution that they took in 1798, that it granted only limited powers, that the states had ultimately the responsibility for checking the federal government in case it tried to abuse its powers and so on. That was not invented in 1798, but instead was exactly the version of the Constitution that had been sold to the people during the ratification process. Now, listeners may be thinking, well, why did he keep using these words, ratification process? What does that have to do with anything? And the answer is that if you have government by consent, then the government has to be the government that the people consented to. And it was during the ratification process, the formal process of agreeing to the Constitution in 1787 and 88, that the dispositive, the authoritative reading of the Constitution was laid out. So in other words, while the kind of state supporting, unlimited power supporting past scholars have said that there was something new about the position that Jefferson and Madison took in 1798, this book shows no, there's nothing new about it. It was precisely the same version of the Constitution that Madison and his fellows had sold to people in Virginia in 1788. And I could add that it wasn't only in Virginia that this version of the Constitution was being sold. I know of people in 7 other states who were saying at the same time in 1787 and 88 that if you agree to this new Constitution, it'll only give the Congress the powers that are expressly granted, and that would mean, as we've often heard from Rand Paul, other liberty-minded members of Congress, that if you want to justify a particular policy of the federal government, you have to be able to point to a provision in Article 1, Section 8 that says Congress may do this. In fact, you see at the very end of the book, next to the last chapter, at the end of Madison's presidency in 1817, he faced a situation in which Congress presented him a bill that was going to provide a national federal funding for a national network of roads and canals. And Madison, in his very last official act as president, vetoed this bill. Well, when the Speaker of the House heard about that, he is supposed to have exclaimed, "What? I thought it was Madison's bill." And in fact, the other fellow who had pushed it through the House of Representatives, John C. Calhoun, went and met with Madison about this veto and said to Madison that I regret that I have given you the painful duty of vetoing a bill proposed by your friends on your last day in office. But Madison's explanation was that, yes, it's true that I have repeatedly called on Congress to provide for a national network of roads and canals, but I also said that in case you found a defect in your authority, you should apply the remedy which the Constitution has so wisely provided. In other words, in case you find that you didn't have constitutional authority to do this, you should amend the Constitution first. So Madison said, you haven't amended the Constitution first, which means you still don't have power to do this under the Constitution, and I have to veto it. Notice what Madison was doing was he was vetoing his own idea because there wasn't constitutional authority to behave this way.
Imagine that. It's so, that's unthinkable today that the president would even think about the Constitution, let alone go against his own interests in doing so. Professor Gutzman, exactly. I'm told we have to move along with our broadcast, but thank you so much for joining us. Can't wait to read the book, and looking forward to the next one too.